There is a player in the NHL right now who, in my opinion, should be the easy frontrunner for NHL MVP at the halfway point of the season. But from the sense that I've been gathering around the hockey world, he's not even really in serious consideration, so I am going to try and rectify that. And this discussion was kind of spurred by a tweet from Paul Bissonnette where Biz asked who was everybody's MVP frontrunner through the first half of the NHL season. He listed Nate MacKinnon as his top dog, Austin Matthews in second, and then he said a few guys in third place. And looking at the replies from the fans, there were a few other names who started to pop up very regularly: Nikita Kucherov, Sidney Crosby, Connor Hellebuyck, and David Pastrnak. Now, as you could tell from my thumbnail, there's one of those guys who I think is kind of ridiculous to be put in that conversation, but we'll treat all of these as legitimate MVP candidates. But first I want to ask the question, what is an MVP? Because there are 4 distinct definitions that I've seen most people use. First being, who is the best player on the best team, the guy who has led their team to be the best in the NHL. And for purposes of this discussion, we'll say like the top 3 teams. Second definition I've seen is just the best overall player regardless of team. If you're the best player in the league, even if you're on the worst team in the league, you're the most valuable player. Third definition I've seen is the most valuable player to their team, which I take to mean the player whose value is so big compared to the rest of their team that they just add the most value to that team. And then the fourth definition I have seen is sort of the same definition of biggest gap in value, but with regards to position, like who is the best defenseman compared to the best forward, and how big is the gap between that top defenseman and the second best defenseman and the top center and the second best center. So we're going to go through each of these 4 definitions for MVP to suss out who are the true candidates and to assess what it means to be best or most valuable. I'm going to use a stat that I use a lot from Hockey Reference called point share. And I like point share because it is a stat that accounts for not just a player's offensive production, but also for their defensive. So it values centers who are very good in their defensive zone, but it also weighs goal production more than assists because, as I've said many times in the past, scoring goals should be valued much more highly than getting assists because it's a lot easier to get assists. There are more of them available. So let's go backwards in terms of the definition, starting with the position by position value. What is the greatest gap in point share value between the best player at each position and second best player at each of their positions? Now, starting on goal and working our way out, the 2 best goaltenders in terms of point share on the year are Winnipeg's Connor Hellebuyck and Ilya Sorokin of the New York Islanders. Hellebuyck is higher than Sorokin, and the gap between them is only 0.4 points, meaning the difference between having Connor Hellebuyck as your starting goaltender or Ilya Sorokin is about half of a point over the course of half a season. So that doesn't really seem like there's a ton of value that Hellebuyck has over the rest of the goalies. But now moving to the defensemen, you can start to see what a gap actually looks like, because the 2 best defensemen on the year in terms of point share are Quinn Hughes of the Vancouver Canucks and Cale Makar of the Colorado Avalanche. The gap between those 2 is 1.6 points, meaning a 1.5 point difference between having Quinn Hughes versus Cale Makar on your team halfway through the season. Over the course of the season, Quinn Hughes adds 3 points, these are standings points, worth of value to his team. That's about a win and an overtime shootout loss that they wouldn't have had otherwise, just off of one player. For right wing, we have David Pastrnak and Nikita Kucherov as the top 2 players. The gap between them is similarly as small as the gap between the 2 goaltenders, 0.4 points. For left wing, we actually have Artemi Panarin of the New York Rangers and Edmonton Oilers' Zach Hyman. Now, the difference between them is 0.9 of a point, meaning the difference between having Panarin on your team versus Zach Hyman is going to be about 1 point, or a win over the course of the year. And then finally, moving to the center position, the top 2 centers in terms of point share on the year are Nathan MacKinnon and Sam Reinhart, somebody who doesn't really get talked about a lot, but is having an absolutely fantastic season. And the gap between him and MacKinnon is actually none. There's no gap. They have the exact same point share halfway through the season. So if you are judging MVP based on who is the most valuable player at their position, you would logically say that the best defenseman in the NHL, one of Quinn Hughes or Cale Makar, should be that person. Or after them, the best left wing, either Artemi Panarin or Zach Hyman. But let's go by team now, because I think a lot of people would say that the most valuable player should be the guy who is most valuable to their team. So I went ahead and found the player with the highest point share on every single team and the second highest on each team, and took the difference between the 2 to find who is the most valuable player to their team. And the answer is kind of surprising, because the top delta in point share is actually for the worst team in the NHL, or one of the worst teams. It's Peter Mrazek of the Chicago Blackhawks. The point share difference between him and the second highest, Connor Bedard, is 2.5 points. But I don't think Peter Mrazek is realistically an MVP candidate, so we'll throw him out. But after him are a few MVP frontrunners that have already been mentioned. David Pastrnak is first, Nikita Kucherov second, Sam Reinhart third, and Quinn Hughes fourth. Now, the difference between those guys and their next most productive teammate is about 2 points, while the difference between the other MVP candidates like Hellebuck, McKinnon, and Crosby is only about a point. So based on the two measurements of value that are relative to a player's own teammates and relative to other players at their position, I think we can very safely eliminate both Sidney Crosby and Austin Matthews because they're towards the bottom of both of these categories, whereas the others are at least positive in one of these categories. So that leaves us with prospective candidates of Quinn Hughes, Nikita Kucherov, Nathan McKinnon, David Pastrnak, Connor Hellebuck, and Sam Reinhart. Then we move on to the best player on the best team, which right now, in terms of points, is the Boston Bruins, but right behind them are the Vancouver Canucks and Winnipeg Jets. So that would leave us down with three candidates, David Pastrnak, Quinn Hughes, and Connor Hellebuck. And between those three, the one player who has gotten significantly less buzz around having an MVP season, who is also the best player in terms of point share in the entire NHL, and the guy I think should be the frontrunner for NHL MVP this year, is the Vancouver Canucks defenseman Quinn Hughes. In my opinion, even though he is probably a shoo-in right now to win the Norris, he should also 100% be the leader in the clubhouse to win the Hart Trophy. As mentioned before, the gap between him and the second best defenseman is about 2 standings points, as is the gap between him and his next two closest teammates, Thatcher Demko and Elias Pettersson. He is the best player and the captain of one of the best teams in the entire NHL, a team that could very easily end up winning the President's Trophy, and he is the best player in the league. In my opinion, if you are not picking Quinn Hughes to win the Hart Memorial Trophy at this point in the season, you don't know what you're talking about.